Now we're talking about a very serious subject, doctor-assisted dying for the terminally ill. It remains a controversial subject in the UK, although it's actually legal elsewhere in Europe and it actually in several states in the US. Now, a survey of nearly 30,000 members of the doctors' trade union here has shown that medics are split on the issue of assisted dying. It's increased pressure on the British Medical Association to drop its opposition to it. And at its annual representative meeting next week, the doctors' trade union is to consider a motion recommending that it adopts the neutral position on the issue. So, joining me now is David Galloway. He's a surgeon and a former president of the Royal College of Physicians. I knew I was going to struggle with that word. I could see it coming and thought, oh, God. And surgeons. David, talk to me about this. What are your thoughts of whether it should be something whether it should remain neutral, or should there actually be some sort of guidelines?
Yes, thanks, Nana. Thanks for the opportunity of just discussing this. I agree with you. It's a very important subject indeed. The situation right now, as far as the British Medical Association are concerned, is that they are officially opposed to the idea of physician-assisted suicide. Now, the pressure that you mention is an attempt to drive them to a more neutral stance. Now, my view is that driving the BMA towards a more neutral stance, which actually is a stance that they've had before. About 10 or 15 years ago, they were neutral and then became opposed to the issue. The arguments haven't changed dramatically. If anything, there's more of a case against assisted dying than there was 10 or 12 years ago. But the drive right now is to push the BMA membership, which is fairly representative of many doctors in the United Kingdom, to a neutral position. And I would see that as being a move very definitely in the direction of an approval for this. And I remain, with many of my colleagues, in fact, most of my colleagues, fairly vehemently opposed to the notion.
Really? Why? Why do you oppose? So you actually oppose assisted dying? You're not. What are your reasons?
Well, the reasons are, there are numerous reasons. I mean, I suppose if I could try and encapsulate one or two of the principal reasons for you. Number one, I think that such a law is unnecessary. We have a system, particularly in the United Kingdom, of palliative care, which is really outstandingly good. And I'm in a position, for example, of having, throughout my career, managed patients at the very end stage of sometimes difficult and distressing illnesses. And to be quite honest with you, I've never been in the situation where I felt that one good option would be to actively terminate the life of the patient. I think there is no doubt that palliative care, when it's delivered and the patient is properly supported from the point of view of physical symptoms, when they're properly supported in terms of psychological care, even spiritual care, then the need and the desire for an assisted death tends to melt away and is by far in the minority. So number one, I think it's unnecessary. The second thing, and there are many other things I could mention, I'll mention one more right now, and it's this. I mean, doctors are interested in reducing suffering. I mean, we're all on the same side as those who would push for assisted dying as far as that's concerned. But the business of trying to deal with suffering in a humane way, if you're then going to introduce the notion that actively terminating a life is the best solution to that kind of crosses a bit of a Rubicon for the medical profession. We're in the business of reducing suffering and preserving life, not trying to conflate the reduction of suffering with the termination of life. And not only is it unnecessary, I think it's, in a situation like this, I would just regard it as ethically wrong. Now, there are all sorts of ethical drivers, of course. And of course, one of the principal arguments that comes out is that patients ought to have the right to make their own decision. They ought to have a degree of autonomy. And of course, the conflict there is with the real value of human life. My real concern is a wider concern for the community, because not only is this unnecessary, not only is it ethically dubious, I think the real danger is that those who are vulnerable, who might find themselves feeling as if they're a burden on others, they find themselves in a situation, if assisted dying is an option, they find themselves in a situation where they feel that maybe that's something they ought to do. Now, I know there's pushback against that argument. That's something which is relatively untested. And I think if you do speak to people who are in that situation, it's certainly a very real concern. So it's unnecessary. in my view, it's dangerous and it's ethically dubious.
Interesting. I mean, you sort of equate that to reducing suffering, but some people might say that actually prolonging that life might be actually increasing suffering. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting what you're saying, and I do. My mother is exactly the same sort of character. If I say, "Mum, do you want a cup of tea?" She'll say, "No, no, no," because she doesn't want to be a burden. Then you make your tea, you sit down, and then she goes, "Oh, I would like a cup of tea." And you think, "Well, why didn't you say it when I was there?" But the point is, she didn't want to. She didn't want to be a burden to be able to make me have to do more work. So I totally get what you're saying, but it might seem cruel to prolong life, especially when the person is actually mentally capable of deciding their own destiny. I mean, I want to bring you in on this, Danny. What do you think on assisted dying? Do you think the person should be allowed to make that decision?
Well, I listened intently to Mr. Galloway, and he raised some points that I hadn't really thought about or considered. One of which was the point you just made about being a burden, because terribly ill people, when they're reaching the end of their life, they know that they only have a finite amount of time left. And they're wondering about being a burden. And I hadn't really thought of that. And I think that's a factor that should be taken into account. But if I was, like, there's a syndrome called locked-in syndrome, and Mr. Galloway's right, palliative care in the UK is brilliant, second to none. But that doesn't mean that if there is something so awful like locked-in syndrome, where you are literally in a vegetative state and you can only communicate with your eyes. Your brain's functioning, but you can't move a muscle.
Torture.
Now, I don't think palliative care necessarily would be the option for me if I was in that state, no matter how great the care is and no matter how well you're looked after. And I think that it's almost cruel for the doctor to say that it shouldn't be on the table as an option, because there are some conditions where palliative care just isn't the solution, if you like.
Well, I'm going to ask David, refer that to David. I mean, you heard what Danny's saying. What if you are in something like locked-in syndrome and there's no way out? That, to me, being trapped like that would be torture. So you prolonging my life, you'd be torturing me.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting way to put it. Number one, I think you need to realise that situations like that are pretty uncommon. And in fact, the whole business of locked-in syndrome is not well understood from a neurological or a neurosurgical point of view. And in fact, it may be, it's hard to know just exactly how much suffering these patients are involved with. Nevertheless, and here's the point, Danny, that I raised already, the danger here is in dealing with these exceptional cases, and hard cases don't make good law. But if you use that as an example, as the driving force to change the law, which might potentially make literally thousands of vulnerable people in a position where they feel as if they are really not protected, I don't think there are safeguards beyond the safeguards that currently apply in the current legislation that would actually counter that. And so I'd be very worried about that, and I think that's been one of the major dangers that most of the medical profession, when they've really thought this through, have come to realise, actually, that is a real problem and one that needs to be addressed.
Michael, my father, because when you say about palliative care being very, very good, my father had motor neuron disease. Now, he got to the age of 70, he'd worked all his life. He never complained, never mourned, happy-go-lucky fella. He retired, seemingly, look, it was literally like 5 minutes after he retired, we found out he had motor neuron disease. Then he had 2 years of just being pushed around the NHS for fairly pointless appointments because there's nothing they can do for it. He ended up in a hospital bed in his last 2 months of life with fairly ropey care, to be perfectly honest. He was a changed man entirely. He lost any mobility. He could speak. He was being moved around on a hospital bed every day. He just felt a total indignity with his life. Now, he loved his life. In fact, just before he died, he said the best thing he ever did was to have a wife and 2 kids. Now, he would never have wanted to leave that life, ever, but he was in utter agony during the last few weeks of his life. Now, during those periods, he'd say, oh, can't you take me to Sweden? Obviously, he meant Switzerland, but it became a bit of a joke between us all. But even someone like that, my father, he would get up at 4 a.m, start work all day, then come home and play with the kids all day. Now, motor neuron disease isn't that rare, and a lot of people are in that position, and a lot of people would like that option. And someone like my dad wouldn't give up life lightly. So I don't think, there's that argument where if it is allowed, there's not going to be a huge rush for everyone to try and kill themselves. I think people just can't take that agony anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, no, if I might come back to that. I mean, I do understand that dilemma, and I'm not unsympathetic to someone who finds himself in that position. You've clearly had the personal experience of that, and it's incredibly distressing. But what I would say to you is this, that when palliative care is good, and you indicated, at least hinted, that maybe in your father's case it was a bit ropey, I think you said at times. Yeah. But I think it makes the case for proper investment in really seriously good palliative care. When that's delivered, then the idea of an undignified death just melts away. And so I put to you that there's really a case here to drive the argument for even better palliative care than we currently have. I still rest on the fact that there would be a real risk, despite the fact that motor neuron disease is not that rare. It's still relatively uncommon when you look at the big picture, and it's hard to be statistics, to talk statistics when you're really dealing with a personal situation. And I think we're all sympathetic to that. But the reality is you've got to look at the social context of this, and there is certainly a danger beyond the current family or the situation that you have in your sights.
Well, David, I was going to say that you talk about the numbers being relatively small, but in terms of what Mick has just told you, in terms of those who may have motor neuron and may want to, have some sort of assisted death. But actually, the numbers on all of it are small, and many countries have already approved it. So that includes Belgium, the Netherlands, as well as the US. There's some states there. So things have moved on anyway. So why haven't we? Because actually, I hear what you're saying, but you're saying it from a perspective of someone who's quite healthy and fit and seemingly well. But from the actual individual who would like that, surely the option should be available to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good case. And clearly, even within the medical profession, you would find divided opinion. You will find some people who are perhaps very sympathetic to the view that has been expressed by those who want to push through this sort of legislative change. I think, however, even when you look at the public perception, and there's this idea that the public are very much in favour of this, it really depends on the context and how you ask the question. If you make it a simple yes, no, then very often you'll get an answer which is a rather unsophisticated, unrefined answer. When you look at the whole context, then there are lots of other issues. When I was president of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow, I took the opportunity of polling the fellows and members of the college. Now, these are not so much in primary care, but they're in hospital medicine and surgery and so on. And I was very keen to know just what the feeling would be about assisted dying legislation. And it was very interesting. There was a divided opinion. I'm quite open about that. There was still opposition to it, to assisted dying. And when I asked the question, as I did in a questionnaire, admittedly, but I asked the question, would you actively participate in the process of actually terminating someone's life as a positive, proactive move, then a tiny minority were comfortable with that. So I think, there are all sorts of technical issues associated with it. There's the business of who would deliver the service. There's the business of even how successful the service is. You quote some of these other countries. If you look at the detail of how the service is delivered in some of these countries, and some of them, the statistics are pretty dubious, to be honest, but where they're good, it's pretty clear that sometimes up to 1 in 7 of these sets of circumstances where an assisted death is being enacted, in fact, it goes wrong. And it's just not as clear-cut and as simple as it's perhaps portrayed to be. So I think we need a proper debate about this. We need the whole thing out in the open, and we need to understand very clearly what we're asking the population to sign up to.
So you said it goes wrong. So I sort of thought, what do you mean it goes wrong? So they're going through the process of helping somebody die, and it goes wrong.
Yeah.
In what way?
Yeah.
The person, it doesn't die.
Well, there are different circumstances, of course. So sometimes in some of these legislations you mentioned, what's happening is that it is actually the delivery of lethal drugs to the patient for self-administration. In other situations, the physician actually administers the drugs. Now, there's more than a subtle difference between these two scenarios. But nevertheless, in either case, you still have to deliver the drugs. Now, there are sometimes difficulties with the drug delivery. There's sometimes difficulties even with accessing a vein or whatever. It may be that the drugs don't have the desired effect or the expected effect. And instead of the death being enacted within a matter of 4 or 5 minutes, it may be protracted and prolonged and extremely distressing, both for the patient and for their attendance and so on for a much longer period of time. So it's not just entirely straightforward.
Well, listen, thank you so much for talking to us about this now. So it's a very interesting subject, and it's something that people are talking about